Welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb, and thank you very much for listening. Today, I'm really excited to be talking about a new industry and an emerging market and the implications behind that. And we're actually going to be talking about the cannabis industry in the United States with two leading executives in that field, namely Timeka Dew, who is the founder and CEO of Biko Flower, and Tony Kim, who is the CEO of Telos CG. So thank you both for joining me for this conversation today. As I say, genuinely really excited for this because the cannabis industry is one I know almost nothing about. And there is a lot I think we need to unpack. And actually so much so I've been struggling for ages to think about where we could even start this conversation. I'm sat here on a lovely evening in London at the moment. I think you guys are in the other side of the world in Los Angeles. And where I am, the product we're going to be talking about, namely cannabis, is classed as a Class B drug, which is to say it's illegal to carry and it potentially has a prison sentence. And we have listeners from all around the world. And I'm sure there are kind of similar places around the world where the consequences are the same. And I think even where you are in the United States, there are certain parts of there where that product would be considered legal and other parts it would be considered illegal. And I honestly can't think of a comparative industry or product. So I guess my starting point would be whether you guys could give the listeners perhaps just a kind of short history, the backstory of cannabis as an industry in the United States, i.e. how it even came to exist, and perhaps a little bit about your personal story in terms of involvement in that industry. I'll look to either of you to volunteer to start that conversation. I won't make that decision for you.
Well, I guess I will try to get us started here on the history of cannabis, as I am connected to the cannabis industry as a medical patient. So in the United States, there's really the two ways to look at cannabis: the way that it is federally classified, which is as a Schedule I drug, which is illegal, and then the way that the states, each individual state, classifies cannabis. In the state of California and in many other states now, cannabis has been medically legal for some time and now is legal for adult use. So typically what we see is a state turn on medical cannabis, pass regulations around medical cannabis, protecting and enshrouding the patients and the doctors and dispensers of cannabis medicine. And then those regulations are typically updated to then become adult use regulations that still have some protections for medical patients uniquely, but allow for cannabis to be consumed by an adult use population. And then Tony, do you want to add to that? I've tried to keep it very simple.
Maybe a personal perspective, I spent 18 years in the fashion industry doing brand development and supply chain solutions. And when cannabis was on the cusp of becoming legal, then there's a large backstory to that of why it was originally deemed illegal and a Schedule I drug that I think we'll get into a little more in depth on. But it was, from my perspective, I always had a personal relationship with the plant, and now seeing an emerging market, new CPG to the likes of I don't think we'd ever see again within our lifetime of something that was illegal and now coming on as being legal, considered legal, the likes of such that, prohibition will probably be the last thing that, 70 years ago that we could actually make an actual comparison to. So from that perspective, I thought this was an amazing opportunity of something extremely nascent with a product that already had a built-in demand. We know everybody was a lot of people were using it on a rec level. And now for this to come on, to be able to be part of that initial movement of creating the supply chain, the brand development, the tenets of this industry from the ground up was extremely exciting for me.
So accepting there's always been a market for cannabis, I imagine there always will be. But from a business perspective, how did that happen within the United States? Was there a state, for example, that was the first to legalize this? I'm interested to understand a little bit more about that background.
Yeah, the war on drugs, the way cannabis was weaponized on people of color specifically, and the backlash of that, the impact that it had on communities from the 70s on, really, from our personal kind of recollection or experiences with that, to that now becoming legal, is that there was starting to become a lot more studies and understanding of the plant itself, the medical benefits, how it was weaponized, and the nefarious framing of such. And so that it just started becoming, I think, to a lot of people, absurd from the population standpoint. And let's be real, I think what it started presenting was a tax revenue opportunity from the government standpoint.
Okay.
And legalizing something has traditionally been a strategy around controlling illegal activity going on. So if you are able to put parameters around licensing and business laws and taxable revenue, then all of a sudden now you have an industry that can be controlled, where it was, a lot of that activity was happening, quote unquote, illegally. So I think the culmination of a lot of different factors started coming into play here, where it just made a lot more sense to legalize this. And Colorado was the first state to really go and take that initiative. Followed closely behind was Oregon and Washington and California.
However, I will interject, Tony, that, because we do have such a unique industry, and so much of it is really about that time frame. So California, the state that we're both in, they've had medical cannabis since 1996.
Right.
And because of that, there's some really unique realities just about California cannabis and really West Coast cannabis altogether, which is why we saw those West Coast players be the first ones to say, hey, we've been watching California, we've been watching these medical numbers, we understand how these are going to translate in an adult use market, and we're able to act. But because cannabis had this medical legality since 1996 in California, we saw this really long stage of normalization in California where people really got the idea in their heads that cannabis was powerful medicine. And then not only that, it just became more normalized for folks who could use cannabis for just about any medical reason, to help with anxiety, to help get to sleep. They really started to embrace that in California in a very real way. And I think now, even when we see new states turn on for medical, we're seeing less normalization than we saw in the early 2000s in California, just because there had been so much time for that education to happen. So I just wanted to interject there, because I do feel like there'd be a lot of people listening to this and say, Tony Kim said Colorado was the first state. They were to go adult use. They were adult use for adult use. But what was going on in California in the medical days, there still was pretty decent coverage of, if you wanted cannabis, you could still get cannabis. You could get a medical recommendation from a doctor. So it's just interesting to kind of dive a little bit into that history and why we have so many farms in California, for example. It's because of that history from the medical days in the late 90s.
And Timeka, one of my questions I was really interested to understand, in my naivety of thinking you had a product that was illegal that I guess overnight, I'm sure there was a degree of but became legal, how everything was created, how the supply chains were created, how the kind of stock retail. But I'm guessing, therefore, in a world where medical cannabis was slightly ahead, did that help establish what you would consider to be the normal supply chains of business in somewhere like California?
Well, it did. And see, this is definitely part of the argument of the back and forth within the industry of how we should be doing things. Because a lot of times what happens, and what did happen in California, is the grandfathered in medical supply chain, they would be the first to licensure. So it's the folks who know what they're doing, the folks who already have farms, they already have infrastructure, they can prove they were doing things in a compliant manner during the medical regulations and that they were following those rules to get us to understand that they could follow adult use rules. Now, the problem with that is, if you are not part of a population who had access to the capital that was required to stand up a medical license, or if you didn't have any kind of foothold in the medical industry, you might be kind of locked out of the ability to get into that supply chain when adult use starts. So that's kind of where social equity provisions and things thinking about the folks who are the most impacted by the war on drugs, how we enable them to also get this kind of first ability to have licenses, to have a crack at being a part of that initial supply chain, and not just only allowing for, companies or wealthy investors who maybe had those original medical dispensaries and medical businesses to be the only ones that are allowed to have licenses.
Accepting that there's such a broad things we could be if we took California as our case study for conversation in terms of today, would it be fair to say that you guys were both early entrepreneurs in the sector, or?
Yes, yeah. I definitely was. I'll let Tony go. My husband and I was a medical patient for years and years in California, and my husband and I and one of our friends, it's actually a part of Telos now, ran a medical delivery service in the desert for a couple years. And because of that, if you could prove you had a business that was operating during the medical days, you were able to then apply for a license when it became adult use. So that was one of the ways that we established a couple of our licenses early on.
What Timeka highlighted, there were multiple stages on it getting to the final adult use. So that's a little bit of a moving target question to answer, Simon. It's, if you were early on the medical side, that happened like a little over 15 years ago. And so I'd say myself came in 2017, which was on the cusp early stage of the adult use market in California.
Okay. And Tony, so your background was fashion. What brought you to the market ahead of adult use?
Great question. So, we started seeing kind of the race to the bottom in the fashion industry, as was many other industries, CPGs, and where you saw a lot of the middle tiered areas, the middle brands, middle range department stores and retail channels start losing like the paradigm was shifting in how people were actually purchasing their CPGs. And we saw kind of a bifurcation where
Tony, sorry, just to you used the phrase CPG. Could you?
Consumer product goods.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So there was kind of the premium side and some of the more branding that was happening on that level, and then there was the mass market, and so that really started creating the Walmarts and Targets in that specific industry, and where people were going to get discount products. And a lot of that middle area was deteriorating. I started looking at that as being kind of the beginning of the end on the fashion side, the way we were structured, and thought like this is the opportunity to look at the cannabis side from a very nascent side to be able to start building out with a little bit of crystal ball, thinking like we see certain patterns that are happening on the supply chain over on the fashion side. But keep in mind that took over like 100 years for it to kind of naturally progress and organically go through the changes. And within the last 10 years, with such a sizable opportunity in the cannabis industry, we saw that kind of process, evolutionary process of that industry really going on an accelerated path. And what took like 100 years in the fashion side, we saw transpire in 5 years in the cannabis side. So there was, a little bit of trying to keep up with the, ever-changing industry and the dynamics that were, evolving real time in the cannabis side.
Understood. Then, Timeka, I really want to come back and talk about social equity, which you touched on, because it was fascinating kind of in the previous conversation. But again, just to kind of understand a little bit more about the industry. So you have adult use is legalized. In our prior conversation, you guys talked to me through this idea of, I think you were referenced it as seed to sale, but I'm really interested for our listeners to kind of understand at a point where the product is legalized, there are certain constraints that, again, are quite unique, I imagine, to the cannabis industry, not least this understanding of seed to sale. So could you talk our listeners through what that means? Because I think it's an interesting dynamic in your market particularly.
Yes, and that's very much my bread and butter. I have a lot of background in licensing and compliance, and this is probably the most unique thing about cannabis, the fact that every single state has its own unique supply chain, its own seed to sale requirements, which means that every single CPG, every single consumer packaged good has to go from the cultivator has to get it from a licensed nursery. They have to get their plants and their seeds. And then that licensed cultivator has to sell to a licensed manufacturer or a distributor. And then only the distributor can sell to the retailer. And that's only the way that it is in California. Now, in different states, it's different. There are different rules for how the supply chain works, for how licenses have to work together, which license types, which actual business within the supply chain interacts with the retailer, which business within the supply chain interacts with the tax board, pays the taxes, is responsible for the excise tax and the sales tax and all these different areas. And so that really means that if you're a brand like myself, like Biko Flower, and you operate in California and you have all of your SOPs and all of your considerations of how you do business and how your supply chain works and your costs, as soon as you want to go to New York, as soon as you want to go to Colorado, as soon as you want to go to Michigan, all of those things change, and you have to find new supply chain partners. You have to draft up new contracts and new deals that take into account all of these really unique, specific requirements from state to state.
Presumably, Timeka, in that model, unlike other commodity, like coffee or whatever, you can't, if you have an excess of stock in California in a farm or whatever, you can't move it to Colorado where there might be demand, and so they're completely insular as supply chains, state by state, effectively. Is that fair?
That's right. That is the way that it is supposed to work. Now, to Tony's point, this is the first emerging market of this kind that we have seen and that we will see in our lifetime. So from this illegal plant to this legal commodity that starts with seeds and plants, how those are kind of transferred and and shared across the state, there is probably some lack of compliance in the way that those things originate in different states. There's no way to get to compliance without somebody originally having been there. And that's kind of a part of it too. There's this very real situation where we are not to legality yet at all. So we are still very much in this gray area where things are always changing. And even in Colorado, for example, all of their flower isn't even packaged. They're still buying bulk flower from farmers and then packaging it into jars on site and giving it to the consumer, which is totally different. You're not even allowed to do that in California. So it's like farmers in Colorado and brands in Colorado are trying to figure out ways to work with the packaging with retailers who don't even want to deal with that packaging, who just want to buy bulk and give it out cheap. And then in other markets, you have to be incredibly sophisticated, do a certificate of analysis on every single batch of your product and really make sure that everything is dialed in inside of the package.
Another example of that, in Oregon, they still sell flower in mason jars, a la like farmers market. Like you can go in, open up, and you're looking at different. So each state has its different nuances to how the ordinances panned out and developed respective of. And so when I think of supply chain, there's two main concepts that you're managing. It's inventory management and scalability. Yeah. And in this model right now, both of those are very, very difficult because, to Timeka's point, each state has its own laws and licensing structure. So when you talk about either one of those two, you're talking about within your state. And like when you start looking at a bigger target market, when we start looking at federal legalization, that's not actually possible right now, or from a legal standpoint. So you're now recreating your supply chain, and it's cost intensive to do that.
I was just going to say one other kind of item in this same realm that I wanted to hit on is the kind of difference between what regulators want to see from state to state and how difficult that makes it to plan your business. So in some states, vertical integration is actually required. And by vertical integration, I mean that you actually control your supply chain from your plants to the production to the consumer. Whereas there are other states that do not allow for vertical integration to happen whatsoever. So, let's say you're a company and all of a sudden you decide, okay, we're going to become good at everything. We're going to create these specific, machines that are going to do everything for us. And we're going to proliferate this to every state that's legal. You can't do that. You can only do it to certain states. And then those states might even change their regulations within a year. And what used to be allowed isn't allowed because all of these things are changing very quickly.
Presume there's a quality angle. So, if it's probably a terrible analogy, but you look at something like coffee, right? There's coffee beans, but there's hugely varying level. Is that the same in cannabis? And how does that play out in this slightly, very complicated kind of regulatory environment? Are consumers looking for higher quality products, or do they even know if it's being sold in jars in Oregon?
Well, and this is kind of data and just from the California market that we have personal experience with. Well, you're always going to have your connoisseur, your enthusiast that understands the aesthetic value, the different dynamics and characteristics of what separates something that's premium versus mainstream baseline product. There are three tiers that we generally categorize as outdoor flower, greenhouse, and indoor. Indoor being the highest of quality because you have the environmental controls and whatnot, and then greenhouse and outdoor, right? Like going down in that order. They're associated with a general price range depending on the commodity and how it's trading and what the final form factor application of that flower is going to be, in the sense of in the indoor, there's premium, and that's usually the flower itself, right? Like you're consuming the flower for what it is, and the lower tier is the greenhouse, and then definitely the outdoor usually gets, processed into distillate or some of the, the vape pens, the edibles, of different consumption for delivery mechanisms that have now grown a lot in popularity. So those are the tiers, and you have customers for all of those things. And that was also another kind of education process upon the legalization, was a lot of the customers were still trying to figure out what was their preference of choice. A lot of that interaction at the retail level was a learning process. It was that experience of talking to a bartender and kind of figuring out, and obviously this extremely more applicable for new customers coming in. It's legal now. Yeah. I want to go try out. And like now you're bombarded with all these different types of products and trying to figure out what was the best fit for you. So that was a good 2 years or so, but we're now starting to kind of normalize people understanding the novelty of it is kind of subsided to a certain extent in California, and people know like kind of what their preferred form factor is. And we're starting to see actual data of what's retailing and what's moving through the general population.
And I'll say, from a brand perspective, as a brand who was born in California and has a certain, product selection in California that I can fulfill, that hits all of the flower that Tony was talking about. We have SKUs that have indoor flower, SKUs that have greenhouse flower, SKUs that have outdoor flower that are beautiful and smokable. Now, when I'm going to other states, trying to really figure out how to have a consistent, quality product across state lines is a really huge challenge for the supply chain for any brand owner who's really wanting to be able to tell their consumer, you can count on us no matter where you get us. When you see our name on this product, you know what you're getting. For us in New York, that even means, we're working with this beautiful partners, Big Sky Farms in New York, and we will not be able to offer any of our Black Series SKUs because in New York, they don't allow for any indoor growing. They only have outdoor and greenhouse growing. So in New York, my indoor SKUs obviously won't be available. So for certain brands, it only makes sense to launch certain products in other areas. So you really have to be very nimble and kind of really willing to work with a lot of partners and do a lot of due diligence to ensure that that consistency is there.
Yeah. Tameka, one of the other things you touched on your understanding and expertise around the whole piece of licensing to do with cannabis. And you, in our prior conversation, you touched on this idea of social equity, which I thought was fascinating. Could you kind of talk our listeners through what that concept means specifically in the context of the cannabis industry?
Yes, in cannabis, we have something that I really think is revolutionary and that every industry should really be doing. And that is, as we're setting up the regulations, we are taking into consideration the communities and the individuals who were the most impacted by the war on drugs. So those who lived in communities that had really high levels of policing, high levels of incarceration, for oftentimes very low levels of cannabis. And we saw this all across the country. There was not really just like one state that's only focusing on this. I mean, this was everywhere, a pervasive cycle of racism and targeting. And so we can't set up this new multi-billion-dollar global industry and say, all of you people who were made slaves due to this war on drugs, forget about you. That time in prison, that time your family struggled, those times you got pulled over, all of those things, who cares about them? Now buy your weed from a bunch of white men, who didn't have these impacts. And so social equity, and it looks different in every single state that considers it, is typically a set of regulations and then support that will allow for entrepreneurs that come from communities that have been impacted to be able to obtain licenses and run successful businesses. And I think that and run successful businesses is a really big part of it, because the license in and of itself, I mean, for one, it's impossible to stand up one of these facilities or one of these licenses without a lot of money. So you have to have some kind of investment partner. And oftentimes these investment partners are very unscrupulous with their deal terms. And so we have a lot of predatory practices happening to folks who are supposed to be getting lifted up and helped, through this process and being able to be a part of the supply chain that obviously right now we have something in the United States called 280E. It's a tax law basically that says that we can't write anything off of a business other than the cost of goods sold if it is a business that is selling a Schedule I drug. So cannabis falls under this drug, which means any license can't write off anything. They can't write off any of their regular business expenses. So it makes those businesses incredibly difficult to turn a profit. When federal legalization happens and 280E hopefully goes away, those businesses overnight will become profitable. They'll become something that makes sense to invest in. They'll be able to be banked. They'll be able to get business loans. But until then, it is hard for this social equity community to really be getting themselves on their feet and making sure that there's still folks who are there to contend with and there to build wealth for their communities as we continue to build the industry.
Timeka, is that Schedule I of the drug and therefore the tax implications that you talked about? Again, forgive my ignorance, but is that because that scheduling is done at a federal level And
That's
therefore,
right.
regardless of what individual states do, there's always the federal picture. Is that?
That's exactly right, Simon. That's exactly right. And it is a real federalism debate here. We definitely have had a lot of turmoil and skirmish between the state governments and the federal government, namely in California, from 1996 on through 2016, when they really kind of stopped doing the raids at such a massive rate. They were raiding dispensaries and closing them down, regardless of whether they were, medical and state legal. So there has definitely been that battle of kind of who's in control, what are they going to do? And so it's been interesting politically to see it all play out and how it could affect other industries moving forward. We talk about cannabis, and in certain circles, it's sexy, it's interesting. But when we don't remember about the racist history of like how Black and brown people have been literally rounded up over this plant, it becomes just really dismissive. And so I think that part of that too is that, as we're building industries, even like when we saw the tech industry, it's incredible lack of diversity. And so, with cannabis, that was something that even besides the licenses, we need to make sure that it is a diverse industry that represents everyone that uses cannabis and that has been harmed by cannabis, including the Black and brown folks who have been really uniquely targeted in the United States over the plant.
Is it working? The social equity thing seems to me, fascinating and hugely important, but equally, I'm conscious that those well-meaning intentions may not always translate to the outcomes, particularly, in industries where there's money and all. Do you, Timeka, and from what you've seen, do you feel positive about the impact of this industry on communities?
Well, I do, and I'll tell you why. I mean, one of the reasons is because I've worked as a nonprofit organizer practically my whole life, and I did a ton of national grassroots organizing, specifically around climate and environmental issues. And for me, man, if we were taking this into account for energy companies when they're laying pipelines, and if we were taking this into account, and talking about the harms and therefore how we can engage, because clearly, like, capitalism isn't working the way that we want it to. And so we got to start engaging, new ways. And so for me, even if, these are not programs that are granting, Willy Wonka magic tickets. Sometimes it feels like a Willy Wonka magic ticket, like you get taken into that candy store and it's a nightmare. But I will say myself as a social equity licensee, as running a successful social equity brand, I do feel that we are building this bridge as we're walking on it. And we still have to continue to be committed to building a strong and stable bridge. And that continues to mean that we have to keep looking at what's not working and adjust and, just continue forward. But I think all of this talk about social equity is not working, let's just stop, is obviously another cycle of racism and confusion that, we need to engage in a very robust way.
Just to add on to that, I think the social equity program is working great. It's the industry holistically that's kind of falling apart. Like there was big macro levels, even above the social equity. What, first and foremost, you can't have a narrative around cannabis without talking about social equity and the impact it had. The industry itself has got it's wrought with problems, but like of all the other things that we've talked about from the supply chain and state by state, et cetera, that this is challenging on anybody, right? We're still trying to make sense. And I love that metaphor, Timeka. This is a bridge that's still being built right now. And so people are falling off in the process of building that bridge, like indiscriminately. Probably the only thing that is indiscriminately is like the warpath, the wake of disaster that this is having on a lot of businesses right now.
I imagine one of the cliches people might have about your industry is, cannabis was legalized and therefore people are making money hand over fist. It's just a license to print cash. Is that your experience? Are you?
Yeah, that's one of the really sad ones, because it's so true, especially as a brand owner, man. You go out into the world and people just think I've got $1 million in a Birkin bag from selling this weed that's still federally illegal and that I can't write off any of my business expenses. So yeah, I mean, that is definitely the problem, is that too, investors that are coming into the space, they think it's this short-term cash cow. And this is what I'll say. I'll say that it's definitely an industry that is going to make a lot of people a lot of money, but it is a long game. There is nothing short about the game of cannabis and the business considerations around cannabis. To Tony's point, when federal legalization does happen, whether we get, let's cross our fingers that we get descheduling, because rescheduling is just going to be a whole new war on drugs and it's going to be a big problem. But if we do get descheduling, the way that that is just going to change how everybody does business and all the considerations, it's pretty much like everybody will have to retool everything. But at that point, whoever is still standing around, social equity businesses, businesses that have been here for 10 years, businesses that are just getting in, people are going to make money at that time. And so it's really just a matter of who can survive until then. The people that are, and it's hard to survive. It's very hard to hold on in this particular climate right now.
I always refer to what I call the Forrest Gump shrimp boat phenomenon right now that we are currently living in the cannabis space. Is, there's X amount of shrimp in the ocean. We are in a massive storm. But if you could be one of those shrimp boats that actually weather this storm, there's just going to be fewer players with the same amount of shrimp. So like there's that phenomenon. I think there's that sentiment of holding on, and that's the win right now. Break even right now is a huge win. Like as long as you can maintain your course and trajectory right now of what you're doing, whether you're part of the supply chain or if you're a brand, that's considered a huge win, because we're all the storm will seed when it's federal legalization to a lot of people, and it's going to probably present a whole slate of different challenges that we're going to have to face at that point. But that is kind of the weathering of the storm right now.
Well, and knowing that this is a global market as well, and just understanding that, we will all be sitting around remembering a time where we had to just stay in California, but eventually California is going to be able to send cannabis all over the world. And that's going to be a whole different industry. And so a lot of these farms that shuttered will potentially be able to start back up because they have some of the, knowledge. So it's just a matter of timing. Is this going to happen in 3 years? Is this going to happen in 5 years? And all of those things are kind of ever changing on a global scale.
To answer your original question, that is a myth that everybody's making.
My question was slightly flippant, but I think the underlying business challenges are fascinating. I'm really interested. You both talk in the context of declassification or legalization, whatever the right term is. You both talk in the terms that that's a question of when, not if. Why is it a when, not an if?
Well, in my opinion, it's, is the federal government really going to admit to losing every state to cannabis? And so now it's federally illegal, but it's legal on every state level. Like, for one, they're not going to do that. They're just leaving a lot of money on the table. They're not getting their hands on those tax dollars when they do it that way. And the conversations have been happening for so long. The politics are already in motion. It's not going to kind of reel itself back and become now prohibition. Like, so many things would have to change culturally for federal legalization not to happen. And if it doesn't happen within certain amounts of time, you will see, I think, different movements of people pushing for it to happen. I think right now everybody's kind of waiting with bated breath, but I think, if it started to take too long, and I think because there are different things happening too, medical research initiatives that have been happening across the country and around the world, different things that keep people hopeful and engaged outside of when will federal legalization happen? But it's definitely something that has been in the works and is constantly being pushed. There's no danger of it not happening.
I think it's one of the only bipartisan kind of conversations that both sides agree upon. We're seeing state by state starting to come online, and a level of speculation in this comment, but I see, my opinion is that it's actually the states right now that are slowing down federal legalization as opposed to the federal government, meaning there is an arbitrage effect happening when you come online and first go legal or adult use. There's benefits. There's a novelty, people are rushing, and there's tax revenue being collected, there's business money actually being made. And then you start seeing the normalization of all that, where you see commodification, lower margins, et cetera, et cetera. And then you start seeing it come into what we're actually going through in California. And we're seeing this pattern state by state. And so there's that initial rush where, hey, we want to maximize our industry. And there's some positive. You're supporting local businesses and your licensure types and whatnot. And then we'll open this up. But what that's happening, like the first movers, such as California, and the size of California, has definitely feeling the effects of that as we're waiting for every other state to start coming online.
Well, and I think the lack of normalization also doesn't help when it comes to federal legalization, because right now what we're looking at is just such high taxes due to kind of, I think, this racism and this thought process that, like, if we're going to have cannabis, we really better be making this windfall money that we can give back to the police to make sure things stay safe, which is what's happening in many communities. So if we kind of, I think, had more normalization, less taxes all around, people are really afraid that when we get federal legalization, we're going to have these high state taxes that don't go away. Now we got a federal tax that's going to be imposed on top of that. How is that going to be negotiated? So I think there needs to be a coming together of the business kind of thoughts around it, but also the cultural and societal notions around it, and starting to be a little bit more realistic about this plant and its benefits and its lack of kind of safety issues, especially when we have it legal.
Guys, that feels like probably an appropriate place to draw the conversation to a conclusion. Genuinely fascinating. I feel like I've learned loads about something I knew very little about. Thank you both for taking the time to chat to me today.
Thanks
so much for having us.
Yeah.
And an honour to speak to the unofficial mayor of Koreatown as well.
If you ever come to LA, Tony will take you to Korean barbecue, and he's definitely the one to go with. So hit him up for sure.
100%. Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics, or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.